Good morning. So, the cool thing about Nope. I got the mic. So, the cool thing about being a pastor is that people don't give you like normal gifts. Like, now look, this is perfect because I like this, right? But somebody gave this to me just yesterday. Oh, it's Pastor Appreciation. I'm like, is it? All right. Okay, I did not have a Celtic short sword, and this is kind of cool. So this lives in my house. Yeah, it's kind of fun, and we're gonna need that in a minute. Actually, it's good timing. We're talking about compromise this morning. And we've been in the book of Revelation. And of course, if you haven't been with us or following, you're like, book of Revelation, really? Really? Yeah. Why not? Let's get into it, right? And today we're talking about compromise. And I don't know about you, but when I was a kid in kindergarten, all right, compromise was one of those words that got its own like poster on the wall in the hallway, right? Like compromise. We all need to learn how to compromise, right? That's a good thing. But like, I don't know if you had the same experience, but you get a little bit older, and then you start to question whether compromise is such a good thing after all. Because you see people doing compromise, and maybe somebody's getting married, and Momzilla wants a certain kind of cake, and Daughterzilla doesn't, and then there's a thing, and well, I like rainbows and dinosaurs, and the other ones, well, I like, Martha Stewart stuff, and they're like, well, we'll just compromise and meet in the middle. And then you get the ugliest cake in the world that nobody wants to touch, right? If you're a hostage negotiator and you compromise with the person who's holding people hostage, like, well, you don't get to kill all of the people, you could just kill some of them, and we won't give you quite all the money, we'll just meet in the middle. It doesn't really work, right? There are some things where compromise is not the best tool. And maybe as a Christian, you sometimes wonder, where am I supposed to compromise? Because believe it or not, the world that you live in does not exactly favor Christianity. Like we're not the most popular bunch right now, haven't been for a while. And so you constantly find yourself in a world surrounded with all these ideas, and a lot of them have nothing to do with your ideas, and guess what? The world doesn't care, right? So you're constantly having to figure out, how do I go to work and be a Christian? How do I, take my kids to parties and be a Christian? How am I supposed to go to school and be a Christian? How do we work this out, right? And so you question, well, is compromise right? When do you do it? When do you not do it? And it's fascinating because today happens to be a letter to a place where compromise is the big topic. And he's writing, this is John's revelation from God to the churches in this area, all the churches in the province of Asia. He says, to the messenger or the angel of the church in Pergamum, write this: these are the words of him who has the sharp, double-edged sword. Pergamum, back up for a second. If you read about Smyrna and Ephesus, we've talked a little bit about those guys, but Pergamum is a big city, it's a big region, and it's a government kind of a place. It's like Albany, okay, for that world. It wasn't Rome, it wasn't the biggest, but there was a lot of government activity, and a lot of people were constantly watching everybody else. That's kind of how it is when you go and move into like D.C. or something. If there's a lot of politicians around, everybody's always kind of watching what everybody else is doing to see if they're kind of towing the line, and what are they getting away with, how are they, what are they doing. And so Pergamum is a lot like that. And Pergamum is also a place of a lot of, I guess you could say, pagan culture. A big center for it. And so everybody believed in all kinds of things, all kinds of idols, and all kinds of practices and different forms of temple worship, and we'll get into that in a little bit. But before he says anything to Pergamum, he says this: these are the words of him who has the sharp, double-edged sword. And if you backed up and you read chapter 1, it's not just that he had a sharp, double-edged sword, it's that there's this picture that John saw of Jesus, that's who we're talking about, right? With a sharp, double-edged sword coming from his mouth. What a strange picture. The sharp, double-edged sword that comes from his mouth. And what you have is the picture of someone who has the ultimate power to speak final judgment in whatever direction. It's sharp, it's final, it cuts deep. It is the ultimate authority, and he speaks it into being simply by his word. That's the kind of power we're talking about. That's the image that we're talking about. We're talking about a Jesus whose word will be final, and his judgment will land. And that's very, very different. It's very important to just pause and just absorb that for a moment. Because we have this picture of Jesus, and it's just culture, you know. Jesus is loving, right? Jesus is loving, but our picture of love is just, you know, it's flowery, right? Love is flowery. It's rainbows and sprinkles and unicorns and oh my, you know. And this is a different kind of a love. This is a different kind of a picture than we're used to. You might want to listen. That's the point. Listen. This is not nobody. This is not your weird Uncle Al who always has an opinion about everybody and he's judging you. This is not who that is. This is Jesus. And he says this, I know where you live. Already you're kind of, he knows where I live. Of course he knows where I live. It's Jesus, I guess. No, it's not that. It's not like that. Okay. He says, I know where you live, where Satan has his throne. Yet you remain true to my name. You did not renounce your faith in me, not even in the days of Antipas, my faithful witness, who was put to death in your city where Satan lives. Well, does Satan literally live there? I mean, is there like a, Satan Boulevard, and he's at the end of it with his hat? Like, what is he talking? Remember, it's symbolic. It's a metaphor. He's talking about the things that take place in this city, and this city has got some wild stuff going on in it, and it's got it going on to the point it's really just not been safe to be a witness to what Christ has done for you. And this Antipas, of course, is a prime example. Everyone could remember from this place what happened to Antipas. He was a faithful witness. They killed him. And it's hard to be exactly sure what kind of wickedness particularly, because we weren't exactly there. But the truth is it was a government city, and so any kind of suspicious behaviors, any kind of like anti-government sounding activity would arouse people's suspicions. People were very conscious of which idols people saw who worshiping or maybe not worshiping. Being a Christian was actually, you'd think this is weird, but people accused Christians of being atheists. Why? Because Christians wouldn't worship any idols. Like, what's wrong with you guys? Aren't you believers? Like, what kind of wicked, evil things? And of course, they had a long history of believing that the gods would, get mad if we don't get worshipped and our idols aren't honored. And so, there was a danger of, well, if we have a whole bunch of people who aren't worshiping the idols, then there's going to be, there's going to be punishment brought down on us, and we're going to fail. And if we're failing, it's because of you. It was a thing. And so a lot of times what would happen is, if somebody got real suspicious of somebody else, they'd say, all right, well, we'll call him to account here. We'll just settle this matter. We'll all just go down to the temple of the Caesar, and you will offer a sacrifice to Caesar as your Lord. And that will just settle everything, and everybody will go back home, and everything will be fine. And some of them wouldn't. And then you got a problem. Sounds like Antipas was one of those people. And Jesus is saying to them, guys, look, I know what you face. I know. I know what the culture is. I know it better than you. I know exactly how people are. I know exactly how evil is. I fully understand it. Some of you kind of struggle. You're like, I can't believe what is going on around me. I can't believe people are like this. Jesus sees it. And here comes the good part. He's proud of them. He's like, look, I see, in spite of all of the outward stuff that is against your belief, you have not backed down. That is worth noting. It's been dangerous for you to believe what you believe, and you have not backed away from the Jesus nameplate. It's good. But then he says this. He says, nevertheless, I have a few things against you. There are some among you who hold to the teaching of Balaam, who taught Balak to entice the Israelites to sin so that they ate food sacrificed to idols and committed sexual immorality. Likewise, you also have those who hold to the teaching of the Nicolaitans. Somebody better call time. Mike, call time. Time out. Thank you. Time. What? What? So there's a whole lot of something going on there, and I'll just, rewind for a second. What is he talking about? Balaam, Balak, enticing people, Nicolaitans. What? So here's the story. Pre-Jesus, we're talking centuries before this moment, Israel, the Jewish population that was raised up from one tribe and filled up the space that was given to them. They were led into this area that God told them, you are going to have this land. And so they set about going after battles to clear the land of all kinds of wicked craziness. And that's a big story. We can't get into all of that, right? But as they were going through, they were just having victory. And so they were, taking area, taking land, and there was a group that was led by this guy named Balak, a king of sorts, right? Sort of like the big tribal mayor, you might call him. And so he saw these guys and gals rolling through here, steamrolling into the land, and he said, all right, what are we going to do? So his first thought was, I've got this prophet guy named Balaam, and he seems to have a true gift. When he speaks things into being, they happen, right? Nobody else can claim that, but this guy's got something. Somehow it's real, and so I could just pay this guy to curse all of these people, and then they'll leave us alone. And so he tries to do it. Right? He gets a hold of Balaam, and Balaam at first is like, oh, all right, yeah, we'll do that. And so he's got, dollar signs in his eyes, and he tries numerous times to actually do the thing, and here's the problem, God won't let him do it. He won't let him do it. And his message, and I'm paraphrasing, is basically, look, I've already told these guys they're going to be blessed as long as they cooperate with the plan that I have made and they obey, they're going to get the land. That's how it's going to work. And so Balaam tries, even though he realizes this, he tries, and it comes out, he ends up blessing the Israelites, and it's just like, what? And of course the king is angry, and so it would have seemed that he has failed at this plan, but then a light bulb goes off. And so he goes to the king with this plan. He says, I got a new plan. Okay? We can't beat him outright. God is apparently real. Can't stop him. So what's our best bet? I know. We'll get them. We'll be friendly. We'll roll out the welcome mat, and we'll get real friendly. Nudge, nudge, wink, wink. And we'll put on some amazing feasts. Amazing feasts. These guys are battle-hardened soldiers. They've been out there. They're weary. They're tired. They're tired of eating manna and bugs. And, it's sandy out there, right? Let's put on a real good feast as part of the worship of our gods. And we'll invite them in. Well, it'll be a cultural exchange. Right? We'll share ideas. Oh, this is how we worship here. So it'll be like a delegation party. The ladies will put it on. And by the way, you don't have to advertise this outright, but part of the way that we worship our gods on our big feasts is I'll take our clothes off. And yeah, so there's that, right? And so we'll just entice these guys, and so we'll just get them to do the things that they were told definitely do not do. Ever, under any circumstances, don't participate in idol worship. Don't be sleeping with people who have completely different pagan cultural ideas than what you've been given from me. Do not get mixed up there. And of course, they get sucked right in like a tractor beam and get involved, and then there's problems. And apparently, all these years later, virtually the same thing is taking place. They're getting sort of steamrolled by the ideas of this group called the Nicolaitans. And who are the Nicolaitans? Well, there was this guy named Nicolaitans, and he actually he was a teacher, and he wasn't too bad, but somebody took his ideas and kind of like morphed them and flipped around into something completely different. And what it turned into was, look, when you become a Christian, you pretty much do anything. There's really no point in trying to like separate your behavior from the behavior of the rest of the world. There's grace. God gave us grace. We'll rely on the grace. Just do what you want. And Jesus says, no. 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 And so, there was a lot. And if you back up, listen, this was always a problem, and still is a problem, because when you become a believer and you say, I commit myself to Christ, the way of Christ, Jesus puts out this standard of good, which is totally unobtainable by anyone, and yet he says this is the mark. And then we're to give ourselves completely to chasing and hungering and thirsting after that standard out of love and out of gratitude for what he's done for us, right? You should nod your head because that's the way it is, right? And so here's the problem. They're always got a mixed audience. There's Jewish people who grew up following very tight regimens of rules, and there are people they call them Gentiles, non-believers, who didn't have that regimen of rules, and their version of religion and beliefs is usually fixed around idols and going to temples and offering food and having feasts together, and all kinds of wild stuff is going on at those parties, right? Wild stuff. And so they're like, well, how do we do this? And so they're always this clash, because Jewish people are like, you cannot be doing that. There's no way that's okay. And of course, everybody that wasn't Jewish who received this was kind of like, woo la la la. Maybe not quite. And so early in the church, you need to know this, early in the church, you can read about it in Acts, the book of Acts, written by Luke, same guy who wrote Gospel of Luke. In Acts 15, when the Apostle Paul was beginning to take the message to non-Jewish people, it was like this huge deal. Like, you got to make them Jewish first, and the guys are going to have to get circumcised, and they're going to have to learn to follow all the rules and the sacrifices. And Paul's like, no, that's not what it's supposed to be. And so there's this big, like, whoa, well, what are they supposed to do? Because they're acting nuts. And so the council comes together. There's actually a council formed, the head of which was Jesus' own biological brother, who started as a doubter but became a believer later, which, by the way, what would your brother have to do to convince you that he was Jesus? Maybe he'd have to die and be brought back from the dead, and well, there it is. And so they come together and they say, okay, look, our job, this is our decision, our job is not to make things difficult for people who are becoming believers. That is not our job. Our job is to usher people into the kingdom. However, since there is so much confusion around a few issues here, we're going to put out a little memorandum, right? About a few things. We're not filling your head with all kinds of rules, days, when, how much, all that stuff. We're not doing all that, but it seems to be an issue in these three big areas. And here are the three areas. These were the little rules that they were given. Don't eat meals that are part of idol worship. Just don't do it. Don't do it. Don't do things that are sexually immoral. Don't do it. Don't eat meat that wasn't butchered. Yeah. You're like, well, that last one's pretty easy. Don't eat meat that wasn't butchered. Who doesn't butcher meat? Well, actually, that was a thing. People will be like, I'll just, strangle this chicken and then just throw it right on the grill, feathers and all. I'm like, oh, that's not a good idea. This is where it started. Don't eat meals part of idol worship. Don't do things that are sexually immoral. Apparently, Pergamum was failing out on 2 out of 3. Like, honestly, there are so few rules in Christianity. These are the few rules there are, and they're bombing 2 out of 3. What? And this is what he says. He says, repent, therefore, otherwise I'll soon come to you and will fight against them with the sword of my mouth. In other words, change your will on this. Don't let this continue, because remember, I am the judge. I am the judge. Don't go around teaching people that sin isn't sin. Like, stop that. Don't go around teaching people that sin doesn't matter. Sin is irrelevant anymore. There is no such thing as sin. Like, stop that. There is a standard. And actually, we spent weeks and weeks and weeks covering what the standard of Jesus was. Of course, it was way more demanding than any of the Jewish population had any idea of their whole lives. What? Wait a minute. The standard is to be better than just with everybody. Better than just? That's the standard. Okay. The standard is don't retaliate against people. The standard is sexuality experienced in the parameters that I gave to you. Okay, all right. They're honoring parents honoring children. The standard of doing what you said you would do. What? Wait a minute. Can't we get it? No, that's the standard. The standard is self-sacrifice to the point of death for the benefit of others. Whew. Of course, when you absorb all of that, only conclusion that you can actually come to is, I can't meet that standard. Never have, probably never will. Well, that's good, because that's true. But this thing goes on in us. We have this little war going on. We're like, well, yeah, but what about Jesus is gracious. Jesus is gracious. Jesus is gracious. Jesus is gracious, right? Isn't Jesus gracious? That's what we're told. And yet, he's hanging on to this standard all the time. Like, you would think if a person was really gracious, they would just you could fudge it a little bit, right? You could bend it. And here's the problem. Grace is not the same thing as compromise. It's not. It's not the same as compromise. Right? See, the God that we know of is so able to forgive a mistake. He is so able to forgive even intentional things that we were doing. And if, I don't care about all that. I don't care if there's a God. We do all these things, and then later on we're like, I wish I'd never done any of that. I'm so embarrassed. I'm so ashamed. God is so ready to forgive a sin, a mistake. So ready to forgive a humbled heart. And at the same time, he is so unwilling to bend on his version of good. Not changing it. Not budging an inch. And the problem with, Balaam, Balak, the problem with this church in that time was that they thought if God's gracious, God would be willing to compromise a little bit. I could get God to bend a little bit on this so I can get a little more of what I want. That's the problem of humanity ever since anybody's even spoken the name of God. Well, if I could just get him to bend a little bit on this one area, if I could just lean on that grace a little bit, then I could get him to, change his mind a little bit. I've heard it said a lot of different ways. Somebody told me one time, I'm really liking God. I'm really, going down that path. But if God's going to take me, he's just going to have to get over some things. God's going to have to learn to loosen up a little bit on some things. Because I'm not down with that, or I'm not down with that. And no. You're not quite getting it. You're not quite getting it. You know, one time, one of my kids, I hope they're not listening, was like, look, I don't know what you think about me as a parent. I don't even know if you know me as a parent at all, right? I like to be kind. I really do. And that was because I met a lot of unkind people earlier in life, and I thought, wouldn't it be great if people were a little kinder? A little bit more understanding, you know? So, you know, as best I knew when my kids would mess something up and say, oh, I'm sorry, I didn't want to, I didn't know, all right, it's okay. It's all right, moving on. But one day, I overhear a kid telling their friend, well, hey, aren't your parents like super strict because they're Christians? Or how are you gonna get away with that? How are you gonna pull that off? I'm like, you know, our ears work pretty well too. And it was something like, I don't even remember what the situation was. Oh, but I do remember. Somebody said, yeah, but they got to forgive you anyway, and you know, blah, 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 blah. And I'm like pastor's kid, so I get away with it. Woo! Huh. Yeah, that was only said one time. I never uttered that again. Still alive, but it's like, no. See, don't mistake grace for weakness. Jesus is full of grace. Jesus is not weak. Not at all. Don't make that mistake. Don't make the mistake. See, the thing is, compromise says, you know, I'm going to do some of the things that God likes, and then the other stuff He's going to have to kind of just like, you know, make room for. I know He doesn't like it. I know He doesn't want it. I just don't care. And the problem is that a God that's gracious, but a God that you can manipulate to bend His will to fit your idea, is a very weak God. That's not even a God, really. You know, that's a God that like needs something from you. And you're bargaining with Him. Well, I'll give you a little what you want, and then you give me what I want, and you'll be okay with this. Right? It's like, no. See, God doesn't compromise. A God, however, that has an unbendable standard, yet no compassion, would be an unloving God. Right? That's not God either. It's very difficult for us to wrap our minds around the picture of the Jesus that's in front of us. This is what John said in his gospel. I bet you've read this before. It's John 1:14. Listen to this. He says, "The Word became flesh and made His dwelling among us. We've seen His glory, the glory of the one and only who came from the Father, full of grace and truth." And the idea here is that you understand that God in Jesus is a picture of complete grace, and at the same time completely true to His standard. He's completely true. He holds the line. And we how can that be? How can you be gracious? Well, actually, Jesus showed it throughout the Gospels. You see the picture shaping up. There's a standard. You can't meet the standard. You can meet the standard in faith because I can meet the standard. And I'll count that to you as righteousness. However, I won't sit still for you to just say, good is evil and evil is good. Do what you want. That's not Jesus at all. Most of the real trouble in the church comes, and get this, as a letter to us, the church, when Christians are willing to compromise on one of those two features. We either compromise the truth part, or we'll compromise the grace part. Both are bad. Both are ugly. You know, that's most of the trouble. I'm telling you, maybe somebody's not going to like this, but I go on TikTok, right? And I look at TikTok like, oh boy, what a crazy world that is, right? And so I'm doing it for access. I'm like, okay, you got to kind of figure out where people are at and see what's going on. And of course, you know, there's all these people. It's just like this wave, overwhelming wave of people who are like de-Christianizing, right? The X-evangelism, the hashtag, no more of that for me, all that stuff. And all these testimonies of people, testimonies. Of course, once you like watch one or two, it's just like nonstop in the feed. It's all you get, you know. It's like I should have a rope around me, okay, and give it to my wife in the kitchen if she's doing something there, and just be like, honey, after 10 minutes, you got to pull me out, okay? Pull me out, because I'm not going to be able to breathe anymore. This is so discouraging. But I'm at least aware. And here's the thing. Most of what I see, most of it, is the result of damage done by Christians who were willing to compromise on either the grace side or the truth side. People get real wounded. Really wounded. It's sad. Like, wow, I can't believe that happened to you. You know, oh, I can't believe that happened to you. Oh, wow, wow, I can't even wrap my head around how that happened. Like, let me go talk to that guy. And, you know, it's just boom, 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 boom. Really discouraging. And, don't read the comments. Don't read the comments. Oh, it's rough. It's rough. We can't afford to compromise on things that matter. You can compromise about birthday cake all you want. You can compromise about which chairs to buy. You can compromise on, well, I like this color better than, you know, I don't want this car. This car is a better car for our family. Compromise on all that stuff. Why? Because it doesn't really matter. But the message to the church is don't compromise on anything that actually matters. Don't compromise on the standard of Christ. Don't compromise on that. Now, that's not the same thing as going around and telling everybody outside the church, you guys are compromising. They don't believe. What? You can't hold them to a standard they don't hold. Stop that. If that's you, stop that. Okay? Stop. Hold out your hand and I'll slap it. Right? This is for the church. This is for you, believer. He's saying, don't compromise. Don't teach people to compromise. Hold the standard. And when the standard seems too great and too heavy, well, that's going to call grace into play, don't you think? Which is exactly what you need to be an effective witness for Christ in this world. When your unbendable truth has no grace in it, you're just a hypocrite. And when you have all grace, and there's no standard at all, well, I don't know what Jesus even needed to die for. He's just fine with everything. That's a slap in the face to Christ, who died for your sin, had to pay the penalty of death for your sin, and yet, well, I guess did he even really need to do that? I don't think it's such a big deal. No, Jesus came full of grace and truth. And that is the mark for us. That is what we're supposed to emulate in this world. I don't know if you know somebody like that. I mean, not perfectly like Jesus, but maybe you could think back to somebody who's made a difference in your life, a real impact in your faith, really cause you to pause and consider, what is Jesus? Who is Jesus really? I'm telling you, most likely, it was somebody who had learned that grace and truth go together. They belong in the same person at the same time. They're not contradictory. They're actually complementary. And if somebody really made an impact in your life, it's probably because they got a little bit of that right somewhere. A little bit. At least. And honestly, some of the most memorable people, and there have been some memorable people in some of your lives because I've heard you talk about them, were people that really, really labored on this, really spent some time in prayer, really listened to their convictions, and they got serious. said, you know what? I can't stay the same. I can't be untruthful. I can't be ungracious. I don't get to pick one or the other, circumstance to circumstance. Because people need to see both. And I don't know if you're discouraged. I have a feeling that a lot of you are discouraged. You know, because you look, and the damage is all over, man. And some of the stories, they're real stories. Like one guy was like, yeah, I was working in a church, and I was the youth pastor, and then I was this other thing, and then they said, we really need to, really need you to do 2 jobs because somebody just left that job, so you're going to be doing both jobs now. And he's like, oh, okay. And they said, well, there'll be a raise. Okay, so he gets his first paycheck working at the church, and it's no different. So he goes to see, well, what happened? And they said, well, it was a raise in the spiritual realm. What? Like, what? People do this stuff, and people do far worse. That's laughable. The other stuff isn't. You get discouraged. And you say, how's anybody ever going to find Jesus ever again? Like, what a mess. And the temptation is to forget all about the power of Christ at work in somebody who actually begins to walk that line. Can you think of somebody? Maybe you can't. Maybe you never had that experience. I can tell you, my experience, my testimony, is that when I have met someone who really hungered and really thirsted to walk that line right, they could tell me things that would have caused me to stand up in my seat for anybody else and grab them by the throat. They could confront me on issues nobody else had the right to. Why? Because they had a balance of grace and truth. I never doubted that they cared about me. I never doubted that they were telling the truth. It's so powerful when you see somebody rise up. And it doesn't even have to be some big hulking, picture of strength that you think of. I don't know what you think of. Some of the most powerful people I met were like under 5 feet tall. I had a grandma that was like terrifying. She was terrifying. She was 4'11", right? And this, frail and soft, but she wasn't soft. And here's the thing. She could tell me things. Other people tell me, and I just I can't stand that person. I don't want nothing to do with them ever again. And she could tell me stuff, and it wouldn't mean that I would like it. But it would stop me. I had to stop because I knew she definitely loves me. She definitely has a place in her heart for me to come and make this right. She definitely is open. The door is open. It's definite. And when that takes place, it's powerful. It's memorable. And I'm telling you, you may despair about, there's all these people over there doing all this crazy stuff they shouldn't be doing and I can't do anything about it. No, you can't. But you can emulate Jesus Christ and carry both grace and truth at the same time. Man, that's like turning on the lightsaber, right? That's like boss level when that happens. You gamers, right? This is boss level Christianity. When somebody walks around with both grace and truth in their heart, it's a memorable time. Jesus, he started one guy. Totally altered the landscape of the entire world. There's a whole bunch of you. Yeah, it's the very thing. Jesus said, I have overcome the world. Fear not, I have overcome the world. You show them a little of the right thing, a little of the real stuff. when you meet somebody, if you haven't met, I'm sorry that hasn't been your experience yet, but when you meet somebody that you are convinced loves you deeply, would forgive you even if you were a jerk more than once, and at the same time will just tell you what they believe because they care and they believe it affects you eternal. You meet one person like that, and you forget a lot of the other voices in life real fast. That's the power of a Christian who walks the line of grace and truth. I think I better stop there. So I'm going to pray this morning. I'm going to pray that we wouldn't be people of compromise in the places that matter. Lord Jesus, you are the guidepost. You are the guiding light. And forgive us for the places that we have wanted you to be something other than what you were willing to be. Forgive us for those places that we're still holding on to things, that we want you to be more like this, we want you to be like that. God, forgive us. Forgive us for trying to tell you who to be. Forgive us for the places that we've been scared to say what matters, to say what needed to be said. Forgive us for the places where we acted like hypocrites, where we stood up and, you've got to do this is terrible. God, forgive us that it wasn't accompanied by grace, the kind of grace that would have taken the anger and the nasty out of that message. God, help us to get it right. We desperately need you. Your Spirit desperately needs to be in us. There's nothing we can accomplish on our own. You've got to do the miracle in us, for us, with us. God, help us. Help us. In Jesus' name I pray. Out of any prayer, and then I'm done, out of any prayer that you pray, I think this one ought to be like number one. You ought to write this thing down, put it on your fridge or something. Pray this prayer every day. God, let me be full of grace and truth. Grace and truth. Grace and truth. Amen? Amen.